Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for taking the time today to view this presentation about hepatitis delta, the hidden epidemic affecting people living with hepatitis B. My name is Beatrice Ovich, and I'm a public health program manager at the Hepatitis B Foundation and manage our Hepatitis Delta Connect program. This is a Train the Trainer presentation, which will hopefully prepare you to share some of this information with others in your community, either formally at health events and in your practice, or informally just among friends and family and other community members. If you would like to test your knowledge about hepatitis delta following the presentation, there is a short assessment quiz available at the end of the training for you to take, which we will talk about more closer to the end of the presentation. You're also welcome to reach out with any questions you may have using the contact information provided at the end of the training. Thank you in advance for your time, attention, and interest in learning more about hepatitis delta. Next slide, please. Thank you. So to start, we'll just do a quick overview of some of the learning objectives and topics that we'll be covering in today's presentation. So we will be speaking about what hepatitis delta is, who is primarily affected by the virus, the prevention, transmission, symptoms, and progression of the disease, as well as testing, treatment, and clinical trials available for hepatitis delta, ways to locate doctors and information for healthcare providers, tips for educating your community. We'll go over some of the challenges and gaps in the hepatitis delta continuum of care, as well as some resources available for you. Next slide, please. Thank you. So first, we'll just start with a quick description of what hepatitis delta is. So hepatitis delta virus was discovered in 1977 by an Italian scientist named Mario Rezzetto. So it's a fairly newly discovered virus. It is the most severe form of viral hepatitis, and it only affects people who are either already living with or at high risk for hepatitis B virus, because it depends on the hepatitis B surface antigen to survive and replicate. And it is the smallest virus actually that is known to infect human beings. Once hepatitis delta moves into someone's liver, it becomes the dominant virus. So it actually completely suppresses the hepatitis B virus. And it's especially dangerous because it promotes more rapid progression to more advanced liver disease and even liver cancer. In fact, the statistic is that about 70% of people who are living with hepatitis delta will experience serious liver damage, and this is compared to only about 15 to 30% of people who are living with hepatitis B alone. And because hepatitis delta becomes the more dominant virus, when it suppresses hepatitis B, the antiviral treatments that are usually used to fight hepatitis B are not effective against hepatitis delta. And different regimens of treatment and management are actually required, which I'll talk about more in a little bit. But it often includes more monitoring and surveillance for hepatitis delta. And this also presents additional challenges in terms of health equity and access. And then in general, there's very low levels of awareness about hepatitis delta, both among people who are living with hepatitis B and healthcare providers, which leaves many people undiagnosed. And so in general, awareness of hepatitis B is already quite low. So you can imagine that for hepatitis delta, it is basically non-existent. So this presents a huge challenge in addressing the virus. Next slide, please. Thank you. So a quick overview of the global prevalence of hepatitis delta and where it appears in the world. So hepatitis delta is estimated to infect between 5 and 10% of people who are living with hepatitis B, although because not a lot of people are tested, this estimate varies quite a bit. So you can see on the slide the global distribution of hepatitis delta virus, and it does seem to be more prevalent in some countries than others, which is unclear why. But countries that seem to be especially affected are Mongolia, Romania, Russia, Turkey, India, and Pakistan, as well as certain parts of sub-Saharan Africa and the Amazonian River Basin. Again, there's still research being done into exactly why these countries and geographical regions seem to be more affected. There are 8 different genotypes, what are known as genotypes of hepatitis delta, which are kind of just variants of the virus. The most common one is genotype 1, and that seems to be found throughout the world. The other genotypes seem to be concentrated in particular regions. And again, more research is being conducted as to why that is. Because the rates of screening and diagnosis and awareness of hepatitis delta are so low, the exact prevalence is really unknown. So generally, hepatitis delta is estimated to affect between 15 and 20 million people worldwide, but there are some researchers who put the rate as high as 62 to 72 million people around the world. In the United States, the exact number is also unknown, but given that the prevalence of hepatitis B is estimated to be at around 2.4 million, just taking 5 to 10% of that number, this indicates that around 100,000 people in the United States could be living with hepatitis delta virus. The estimates are usually between 60 and 150,000 in the US. And this does classify it as a rare disease in the United States, according to the National Institutes of Health, because fewer than 250,000 people are living with the disease. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of who is most at risk for acquiring hepatitis delta, so because again, it's dependent on hepatitis B, the highest risk is for those who are already living with hepatitis B. The American Association for the Study of Liver Disease, or AASLD, recommends screening for hepatitis delta in communities that are especially at high risk. And you can see some of those risk factors listed here on the slide. These include things like being from a country that has high prevalence of hepatitis delta, intravenous drug use, unprotected sex, or having elevated levels of the ALT or AST enzymes, which typically go up when you have hepatitis B. But if you are living with hepatitis B and you see that your ALT and AST levels remain high, even though your hepatitis B DNA levels seem to be going down, this could be because of hepatitis delta, keeping those levels high. So that's why testing is important. The Hepatitis B Foundation does actually recommend that everybody who is screened, who tests positive for hepatitis B, should also be screened for hepatitis delta. It should not just be these high risk groups. Risk-based screening has been found to not be very effective. For many years, risk-based screening was in place for hepatitis B in the United States, just based mainly on country of origin or where their parents were born. And this really put the burden for screening on patients and healthcare providers. And it made things very confusing and ended up having people not be tested. So this hopefully in the next year or so, in early 2023, it's expected that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States will recommend universal hepatitis B screening for all adults and once per lifetime test. And then hopefully following on the heels of that will be a recommendation for a hepatitis delta test for anyone who tests positive for hepatitis B. There's also advocacy being done with lab companies who, if they conduct a blood test and they find it to be positive for hepatitis B, they will automatically test it for hepatitis delta without a special request having to be made. And this is known as reflex testing. So hopefully these things are coming down the pike eventually. But testing still remains difficult, both in the United States and certainly in many parts of the world where resources are scant and awareness is low. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of preventing hepatitis delta, the vaccine for hepatitis B also prevents hepatitis delta, and it is 95% effective at providing lifelong immunity as long as you complete the series, which is either 2 or it's usually 3 doses, but there's a new vaccine that's 2 doses as well, so it makes things easier. For people who are already living with hepatitis B, the best way to avoid hepatitis delta is to avoid blood exposure and to practice safe sex. Next slide, please. Thank you. So there are 2 different ways that a person can acquire hepatitis delta. One is known as superinfection, and this happens when someone who is already living with hepatitis B becomes infected with hepatitis delta. And this is the most common way to contract hepatitis delta. And unfortunately, those who contract hepatitis delta in this way as a superinfection have a 70 to 90% chance of developing a chronic infection of both viruses. And this is true for both children and adults. A less common way to contract hepatitis delta is when someone contracts both viruses at the same time. And in this case, most adults will clear both viruses within 6 months, and there's a very small likelihood of developing chronic hepatitis B and D infections. It's less than 5%. This is not the case with children who do not have, their immune systems are not developed enough to fight off both viruses. So if children contract the viruses at the same time, it is unlikely that they will clear them. So superinfection and co-infection are the two different ways to acquire hepatitis delta. It is important to remember too, though, that if an individual is living with hepatitis B and delta, they are considered to have a co-infection. So the same term is used to describe someone who's living with both viruses. So it's a little confusing, but that is what it means. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just to cover transmission of hepatitis delta, this virus is transmitted very similarly to hepatitis B. It occurs from direct exposure to blood or bodily fluids from a person who is living with the hepatitis delta virus. Again, direct blood-to-blood contact, any form of sexual contact, sharing household items that may have blood on them, including things like earrings, razors, toothbrushes, etc., sharing needles, practicing unsterile healthcare practices, which is very common and still occurs in many parts of the world, engaging in any practices involving skin puncture, such as tattoos or scarification, etc., and then mother to child transmission during childbirth. And it's just a note that even though mother to child transmission is the most common way that hepatitis B is transmitted, it's actually less common for the transmission of hepatitis delta, which is more likely to occur through one of these other methods. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the symptoms of hepatitis delta, like hepatitis B, hepatitis delta is often asymptomatic, and symptoms can take often years or even decades to develop. But with hepatitis delta, since more liver damage is occurring more rapidly, symptoms may show up sooner than with hepatitis B, although this really is different from person to person. So there's no real way to give any kind of timeline for when symptoms may occur. However, it is usually the case that once symptoms occur, this generally indicates that serious liver damage has already happened, which is why it's so important to test early and to detect the virus early so that it can be monitored and managed. And pictured here are some of the common symptoms that can occur, which again are very similar to those for hepatitis B for the most part. The most recognizable one is usually jaundice, which just refers to a yellowing of the skin or eyes. And this happens because of a buildup of a substance known as bilirubin, which is usually handled by the liver. But if the liver doesn't function correctly, then the bilirubin will build up and start to show the yellow color in skin and eye. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just covering the progression of the disease and the outcomes of co-infection with hepatitis B and delta. So again, as I mentioned before, hepatitis delta suppresses the hepatitis B virus and it becomes the dominant virus and the main source of liver damage. And about 70% of people who are living with hepatitis delta will have a progression to either cirrhosis or liver cancer within 10 years of diagnosis without intervention, which involves frequent monitoring and some of the treatments available, which I'll discuss shortly. And you can see the graphic here, which illustrates progression from healthy liver to fibrosis, cirrhosis, and then usually liver cancer is the last stage. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the test for hepatitis delta is just a simple blood test. It's actually two tests. So the first one is what's known as an HDV, so hepatitis delta virus antibody test. And this will tell you if you have a past or current infection. So it will tell you if you've ever been infected with hepatitis delta. And if this test is positive, it should be followed by what's known as an HDV RNA test, which can be qualitative or quantitative. And this test confirms an active infection. So the RNA test will tell you if you are currently living with hepatitis delta. If the RNA test is negative, then a current infection is unlikely. So again, as we talked about before, the American Association for the Study of Liver Disease has risk-based testing recommendations, but the Hepatitis B Foundation recommends that everybody who tests positive for hepatitis B is also tested for hepatitis delta. This is the best way to catch the virus, to be able to treat it within enough time. So tests for hepatitis delta can generally be obtained from a doctor's office or a hospital, although this can vary around the world. In the United States, testing can be obtained through a few different sources, including the CDC, Quest Diagnostics, AREB Laboratories, VeraCore, and Mayo Clinic. Eiger Biopharmaceuticals, which is one of the main pharma companies that is working on drugs for hepatitis delta, has actually funded Hep Delta testing in the United States through Quest Diagnostics. So there's a special requisition form that just has to be filled out by a doctor and then submitted to Quest, and they will conduct the hepatitis delta antibody test for free. So if you're interested in obtaining this requisition form or learning more about this test, you can feel free to reach out to me to request the form. And you can also find it on our website, which is www.hepdconnect.org. There's also work currently being done to get LabCorp to offer this testing as well. LabCorp is the other major provider of diagnostic blood testing in the United States, along with Quest. So that is a work in progress. International testing outside of the United States typically occurs in hospitals as well, but differs according to location. These resources can be difficult to come by, but we have tried to compile some different resources in countries that have high rates of hepatitis delta, and these are also found on our website, which again is www.hepdconnect.org, and it's under the resources section. And all of this will be available after the training as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. So now to talk about what treatments are available for hepatitis delta. So the major new treatment that is very exciting is called Hepcludex, and the generic name for which is bulevirtide. And Hepcludex is the first treatment that has ever been approved for hepatitis delta. It was approved by the European Medicines Agency in July of 2020 for prescription in Austria, Germany, and France. And actually, as of this recording in November of 2022, these are still the only 3 countries in which prescription is available for Hepcludex. So this drug was developed by a very small German pharmaceutical company called MYR Pharma. And this company was acquired by Gilead, which is a very large American pharmaceutical company, in 2021. And at the end of 2021, Gilead submitted what's called a biologics licensing application to the United States Food and Drug Administration for their consideration to be approved in the US. The FDA unfortunately did not approve it as of just last week. So in late October 2022, they unfortunately rejected this application. And they cited concerns about manufacture and delivery of the medication. But the good news is that they did not request additional clinical trials. So they are not concerned about the safety profile of the medication. So hopefully Gilead will be able to quickly resubmit their application and receive a positive response in 2023. And then from there, once it's approved in the United States, there will hopefully be a plan to offer the medication in more parts of the world. So that's Hepcludex. So the main medication prior to Hepcludex that was used to treat hepatitis delta and still is used in many parts of the world is called pegylated interferon alpha. And this has been used since 1980, shortly after the virus was discovered, as an off-label unofficial treatment for hepatitis delta. It is an injectable medication, as is Hepcludex. And unfortunately, it does not have a high success rate. It's only effective in about 25% of people living with hepatitis delta, and it has very challenging side effects as well. So that's been kind of the main medication that's been used up until this point. Again, the antiviral treatments that are frequently prescribed for hepatitis B are not effective against hepatitis delta because it becomes the dominant virus. There are 2 other promising drugs in the pipeline, both of which are manufactured by Eiger Biopharmaceuticals, as I mentioned before, and both of which are in phase 3 clinical trials. The first is called lonafarnib, and results of these clinical trials are expected either by the end of 2022 or early 2023. And the other is known as pegylated interferon lambda, not alpha. And these trials continue to be enrolling. So the treatment landscape for hepatitis delta is really exciting and it's looking up. But again, the next steps are access and equity to these trials. And this includes where clinical trials are held as well around the world. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of locating clinical trials, so there are a lot of trials that are presently recruiting in many different parts of the world, and we do have a tool available to help you find them, which is available on our website that you can click on the slide. You're also welcome to visit clinicaltrials.gov, which is an excellent resource as well that compiles all clinical trials for many different diseases that are happening globally. Again, there is a lot of advocacy happening to try to get more clinical trials to take place in countries that have fewer resources, and especially countries where hepatitis delta is known to be more prevalent. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of locating doctors, it's really important for hepatitis delta to find a physician who's knowledgeable, certainly about hepatitis B, if not about hepatitis delta in particular, but who can kind of keep an eye on the virus and monitor it and prescribe treatment as appropriate. So we do have a physician directory that is international and includes listings for doctors around the world. And it also indicates whether or not physicians treat hepatitis delta as well as hepatitis B. So you can select that. And we frequently put out calls for more physicians to join the directory and advertise it so that more people around the world can utilize it. So we encourage you to click the link and check out this directory as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just a quick recap about why it's so important to test for hepatitis delta. So again, just a reminder that people who are living with hepatitis delta do need altered treatment and management than hepatitis B patients. So it's important, to test so that you can receive access to the resources and treatments that you need. Doctors can really help to connect people to clinical trials that are available as they are happening, around the world and do need people to participate. So, testing will hopefully enable more people to participate in these trials and then make better drugs that can eventually become accessible to more people. And as we do more tests, we can diagnose more cases, which only serves to increase awareness, research, and treatments for hepatitis delta. We can't solve a problem that no one knows about. So that's why this is so important. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just a reminder to try to talk to your community about hepatitis delta and really engage folks especially folks who are already living with hepatitis B, just to let them know that, they are at risk for hepatitis delta. And even though it's rare, it's still important to test for it. Because again, co-infections between hepatitis B and delta do need to be managed differently. And the test it's a simple blood test and it could be available for free in the United States. So they're just important reminders to get the word out in your community. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just an overview of some of the challenges around hepatitis delta. Again, as I mentioned a few times, awareness is so low of this virus, so it's really important to increase it, which is why we so appreciate you watching this presentation. And there's kind of limited testing resources. There's only a few labs in the United States that offer the test, and resources for screening may be hard to come by in other countries as well. The screening recommendations, at least by the American Association for the Study of Liver Disease, are risk-based, which has challenges because it's not universal testing for everyone who's living with Hep B, as it should be. Although in Europe and Asia, the European and Asian Pacific Associations for the Study of the Liver do recommend universal testing for Delta for everybody living with hepatitis B, so that's encouraging. And there can also be challenges with payment and coverage for screening and certainly for treatment and linkage to care. So in general, because of these low levels of awareness and testing, hepatitis delta is often not prioritized in the way that it should be, and it has limited advocacy around it. And there may be additional challenges such as stigma and discrimination that are experienced by people living with hepatitis delta. Stigma and discrimination are well documented for people living with hepatitis B, but it's unclear if this experience is the same or different for hepatitis delta. So there needs to be more research done around capturing the signs and symptoms and the true lived experience of hepatitis delta. So there's more research coming about that in the near future. And there needs to be just more kind of engagement with people living with hepatitis delta in general. It can be hard, again, because of the low awareness, to identify people living with the disease and to engage with them. So this is why, continuing to talk about it and raise the profile is so crucial. And in general, there can be kind of a feeling of a lack of hope around this disease. Treatments can be out of reach for many people, or effective treatments, and so can clinical trials, unfortunately. And there can be somewhat of a widespread perception that there isn't, that no one cares enough about hepatitis delta. This is felt pretty frequently in the hepatitis B community, so this can be even more compounded or pronounced for hepatitis delta. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in order to kind of build a community and provide hope for the virus, the Hepatitis B Foundation in 2016 started a program known as Hep Delta Connect. And the purpose of this program is to raise awareness and promote diagnosis, screening, research, and treatment for hepatitis delta, as well as support for individuals living with the disease and their families and caregivers. And we do this through a variety of different outlets, including email and phone consults, social media graphics, newsletters, a pretty comprehensive website, blog posts, fact sheets, and webinars. So we encourage you to check out all of these resources as they're all valuable and have good information about the virus. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so these are a few ways that you can get in touch with us. If you have any further questions or need support around hepatitis delta, please feel free to reach out to us using any of the channels listed on the slide, and we would love to hear from you. Next slide, please. Thank you. So thank you so much for your time and attention today. Hopefully you found this presentation to be valuable. If you are interested, we do have a brief assessment quiz for you to test your knowledge about hepatitis delta, so you can use the link on the slide to access the quiz. And we hope that you feel empowered to spread the word among your networks and communities about hepatitis delta and to really bring this virus out of the shadows and into the forefront where it belongs. So thank you so much again for your time and attention, and take care.